Most of you may already know Tim Burton's 2005 hauntingly beautiful stop-motion animated movie, The Corpse Bride. But do you know that this movie was originally adapted from a Jewish folklore? This honestly rekindled my interest into watching it again, because in the words of Joseph Campbell, myths are psychologically symbolic. Therefore, its images are to be read as metaphors. What's the metaphor for a guy who accidentally marries a corpse? Or a tragic story about an innocent girl who was tricked and killed by her groom? And what does it all say about one's choices, love, and commitments? The movie primarily follows three main characters: Victor von Dort, Victoria Everglot, and Emily, the corpse bride. The movie starts with the two families marrying off their only child to each other. The von Dorts being relatively wealthy fish merchants, and the Everglots hailing from a line of noble families. This seemingly normal marriage arrangement has something more sinister beneath the surface. The Everglots needed the money to save themselves from bankruptcy.
Couldn't be worse. I'm afraid I disagree. There could be land-rich bankrupt aristocracy without a penny to their name, just like you and me.
And the von Dorts wanted the status and recognition of high society.
Family carried elevated to the heights of society.
To the costume ball.
In the hallowed halls.
Rubbing elbows with the finest.
Having trumpets with her highness.
We'll be there, we'll be seen, having tea with the Queen. We'll forget everything
that we've ever been.
The problem starts to arise when we realize that neither Victor nor Victoria have a say in this arrangement. And yet, they're expected to make what the movie called
requires the greatest sacrifice.
Victoria,
Yes, Victor?
tomorrow we are to be...
Married.
yes. Married.
We can see throughout the opening segment that both Victoria and Victor constantly question themselves on whether or not this is what they truly wanted. This is understandable, yet frankly, their parents don't give a damn. Both the Van Dorts and the Everglots have exterior motives for pushing this marriage, and for them, everything has to go according to plan. In this sense, the parent represents something that often accompanies commitment, which are external forces compelling individuals to make these commitments. Whether it is to fight for one's country, to hold the same religious beliefs as your community, to enroll into college because of your peers, or to marry because that is what society expects of you. So, like so many young people when confronted with such an overwhelming external force, they reluctantly acquiesces and goes through with what was planned for them. We can see this exemplified by the Everglot parents.
Marriage is a partnership, a little tit for tat. You'd think a lifetime watching us might have taught her that.
Do you suppose your father and I like each other?
Surely you must. A little.
Of course not.
Get those corsets laced properly. I can hear you speak without gasping.
In their view, marriage is a tit for tat. This pertains to external factors such as money and status, and such commitments do not pertain to love or feelings. But this is completely false, as this represents a flawed kind of commitment, one that do not involve true faith. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard describes the concept of the leap of faith. He describes faith as a contradiction between infinite passion of inwardness and objective uncertainty. This objective uncertainty points at the inherently illogical nature of faith, as it is understood as a commitment that transcends rationality and reasons. This is concluded in the quote, "To have faith is to lose your mind and to win God." Although primarily attributed to religious context, the concept of faith can be applied to marriage as well. Because there are no empirical evidence that all will be well. But to truly commit, one must make this leap. Although initially unsure, after meeting Victoria, Victor genuinely fell for her, yet he was still nervously hesitant despite the fact. Now this is where it's important to really define the fear of commitment, because one shouldn't mistake this with the lack of love. Because the love, in many instances, may indeed be real, such as the case with Victor as he later confesses. The issue itself is better captured in this scene, where Victor struggles to learn his vows, because at this point he is still internally doubtful of the commitment he was forced to make. And thus, the words were not sincere or even voluntary. He later even said,
"It really shouldn't be all that difficult. It's just a few simple vows."
But I'm sure even he knows that the problem was not in the words themselves. Rather, it is in his internal fears, which will soon manifest herself. In the original folklore version, Emily wasn't quite so nice. She had even forced herself onto the groom and was later dispelled by a rabbi. It is in Joseph Campbell's view that these narratives should be read as metaphors. Essentially, these stories are advice distilled over the course of centuries in the form of a narrative. I argue that The Corpse Bride is an analogy for the fear of the institution of marriage, which has existed for as long as monogamous traditions have been practiced. Check out this novel by Gogol depicting the same thing. Thus from now on, we shall assume that Emily is not real in a physical sense, and is instead the manifestation of Victor's fear. 3 particular fears to be exact. Fittingly, this fear is depicted of a bride, which represents love and commitment, and a corpse representing death. This is the first fear associated with commitment, which we'll call the fear of the eternal. This fear is best described in the vow, "Till death do we part," as there is something universally terrifying about an undefined period of time, which end is only marked by death. And in the movie, we can see Victor very literally running away from his fears. In a lot of instances, an outsider may perceive someone with commitment issue as indecisive, or even worse, a cheater, as they run to another unknown partner. But this is essentially an external judgment about someone's internal issues. To better convey my point, see the scene as an example. The town crier spotted Victor running away from Emily, but instead later recounted that Victor is running away with a mystery woman. Now, which interpretation is correct can only be decided by the individual involved. If number 1, he is running away from fear of an everlasting commitment, or number 2, he's running to another woman. In the second scenario, Emily could also represent the other woman. Now, whether or not this quote-unquote other woman truly exists is irrelevant, as she represents the idea that needs to be put aside if one truly commits. The movie outright says,
Don't you understand? You're the other woman.
that is why later in the movie, Lord Barkis said, always the bridesmaid and never the bride. Because the bride is by definition never the other woman. If you want to look further into this, Victoria cannot play the piano, which Victor is very much fond of. This represents an imperfection. But Emily, on the other hand, enjoys playing the piano. One can see how Emily may represent the potential of someone better. The second fear will be dubbed the fear for loss of potentiality.
And that silly little creature isn't wearing his ring.
And she doesn't play piano
Or dance.
or sing.
And this brings us to the third and last fear Emily represents. For lack of a better word, I will refer to this fear as the fear of vulnerability. We briefly touched upon Victoria's flaw, but just like how it is in real life, all of the characters in this movie is rife with flaws. Victor himself is immature, clumsy, nervous, indecisive. He is evidently very insecure of these flaws and tries to put on a facade or persona. Carl Jung defines this as a kind of mask that conceals one's true nature. This mask hides the true selves and casts a shade known as the shadow. This is the embodiment of our unconsciously repressed thoughts, desires, and faculties. But despite all of his issues, deep down, Victor wants to commit to Victoria. This goes back to the individual's desire to reveal their true selves, shadows and all, without their partner potentially running away in horror. And guess what's keeping him from doing all that? That's right, Emily, his repressed fears. All the while this was happening, Victoria remained steadfast on her commitments. In this case, Victoria represents the partner, the one which is most greatly affected by Victor's afflictions. Even after hearing that Victor was running away with another woman, she remained faithful, not believing that Victor would do such a thing. This could be a manifestation of two things. Firstly, an undying love for one's partner, an admittedly more pleasant interpretation. Or, second, the denial that often develops due to their partner's unwillingness to commit. Because acknowledging that someone you love has commitment issues is a universally difficult pill to swallow. And so, she, like many others, turns a blind eye to his afflictions. However, I much prefer the first reading, that Victoria accepted Victor and all his flaws, his literal skeleton in the closet. Because at this point, Victoria has fully seen Emily, the representation of Victor's fears and faults. And far from running away, she doubled down on her commitments and intended to save him from Emily's grasp. Carl Jung said that a true relationship is one that allows room for individuality, the acceptance of each other's shadow, and to be seen as a whole person. Imagine being in Victoria's shoes, seeing a corpse drag a guy you were set to marry. Imagine what it represents. Wouldn't that scare you off? But that's the truth, whether you want it or not. You, whoever you love, or whoever you will love, will have skeletons in their closet one way or another. And deep down, isn't that what we all really want? To have someone peek below the persona we show to the world, and have them love us despite the fact? And the question will be, will you be a Victoria and love them despite the fact? Through the full acceptance of Victor's flaw. she dispels his fear of vulnerability. 2 remains. Upon being dragged back down to the underworld, Victor is asked to make the greatest sacrifice. For him to drink from the wine of ages and to give up the life he had forever. This can be read as a metaphor for the wine one drinks during the ceremony itself, as one gives up the uncommitted life they previously had. And like death, true commitment is eternal.
Victor would have to give up the life he had forever. He would need to repeat his vows in the land of the living and drink from the wine of ages.
I could never ask him.
You don't have to. I'll do it.
My boy, if you choose this path, you may never return to the world above. Do you understand?
I do.
Although initially afraid of making this decision, in accepting it, he would essentially dispel his fear of the eternal. We are now coming back to Kierkegaard's concept of the leap of faith, because I have omitted an important prerequisite for true faith: anxiety, as it is the only possible foundation for true faith. Thus, in this way, Victor's fears are not only justified, but is even necessary for true commitment. Let me contrast this with Lord Barkis, who, despite the fact he went through the same ceremony Victor was so afraid of, he was not at all afraid of marriage. He was even somewhat nonchalant about it. This is because his character represents a false or dishonest kind of commitment, one which lacks the prerequisite of true faith, fear before the leap. This is because his plans is one in which he's in full control. And thus, he was caught off guard when he wasn't. Back to Victor. I argue drinking the wine and acknowledging death is not the greatest sacrifice, because that is a contract signed the day you were born. It's a promise that will always be fulfilled. Unlike potential, there's a reason Emily still remained, as the last fear, the fear of loss for potentiality, still holds on to Victor, even at the altar. You can see this as an analogy for the thoughts of the groom or the bride about other potential partners who could have stood there with them. One may think that such thoughts run through most soon-to-be couples' head in altars all over the world. But as soon as Victoria steps across him, the last and final fear is dispelled, as if to say the fulfillment of one potential is worth infinitely more than the endless what-ifs Emily represented. And Emily finally let go of Victor. In choosing to commit, the greatest sacrifice was Emily herself. Thank you for giving me the time of day by watching this video in its entirety. I want to give a sincere appreciation for you who left nice comments. I replied to every single one of them, and I probably will reply to every single one in this comment too. And for the 10 of you who liked and subscribed in the last video, I will try my best to live up to your expectations. And if you haven't seen that video, I would appreciate it if you clicked on the box and let me know what you think.